In a courtroom where divorce papers are about to be signed, three triplets make a desperate move to stop their parents from separating. They chain themselves to their parents, determined to keep their family together. Will their act of defiance break the chains of love or force their parents to fight for each other? The Harris family once lived in harmony, a picture-perfect family that seemed untouchable. Emma, a successful architect, and Derek, a renowned lawyer, had it all: a beautiful home in the suburbs, thriving careers, and three vibrant children, Chloe, Liam, and Noah. But over time, their love faded, and the walls they built between each other grew higher. Arguments became routine, silence replaced laughter, and the passion that once defined their marriage seemed to vanish. It wasn't always like this. Emma and Derek had met young, fallen in love, and built a life together. They dreamed of growing old side by side, raising their children in a home filled with love and laughter. But the pressures of work, the stress of raising three children, and unresolved tensions turned their once unbreakable bond into a battlefield. The triplets, however, were oblivious to the adult complexities of their parents' relationship. All they knew was that their family was falling apart, and they couldn't sit by and let it happen. Chloe, the thoughtful and protective older sister, couldn't bear the thought of her family being torn apart. Liam, the more outspoken of the two boys, felt an overwhelming need to take action. Noah, the quiet but deeply compassionate one, knew this was their last chance to save everything they held dear. The divorce papers were already filed. The battle lines were drawn. But the triplets weren't about to let their parents walk away from each other without a fight. The courtroom was cold, sterile, and filled with a heavy silence that seemed to settle on everyone. Emma and Derek Harris sat at opposite sides of the room, their eyes avoiding each other, their hearts full of resentment and hurt. Their divorce had been months in the making, but today it was finally coming to a head. The judge had been patient with the proceedings, but there was no mistaking the finality in the air. The children, sitting quietly behind their parents, could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Chloe, Liam, and Noah exchanged uneasy glances, each one struggling with a mix of emotions. Chloe, the eldest at 13, tried her best to hold it together. She'd always been the one to take charge, the one who tried to be strong for her brothers. But today, her heart was breaking. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. Her parents, the people who had taught her the meaning of love and family, were now tearing each other apart in front of her. It didn't seem real, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Liam, ever the impulsive one, felt his blood boiling as he watched his parents' cold, indifferent expressions. He hated how they treated each other now, like strangers, like enemies. The home he had once known as a place of safety and love now felt foreign, like a house built on lies. Liam's mind raced with thoughts of what he could do to stop this. Anything, really. But what could he possibly do against something so big, so out of control? Noah, the quiet one, felt an overwhelming sadness that threatened to swallow him whole. He couldn't bring himself to speak, couldn't find the words to say what was in his heart. All he wanted was for things to go back to the way they were, for his family to be whole again. But he knew that was impossible. Or was it? It was in this tension-filled moment, as the judge called for a brief recess, that the triplets had their first whispered conversation. Their words were quick and desperate, their minds working in overdrive. They had been planning this for days, knowing that today might be their last chance to keep their family from falling apart. "We can't let them do this," Chloe whispered urgently, her voice shaking. "We have to stop them." Liam's eyes sparked with determination. "What if we—" He paused, glancing nervously at the courtroom doors, his voice dropping lower. "What if we do something drastic?" Noah, usually the most reserved, looked up with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Like what?" Chloe took a deep breath, her mind racing with a wild idea. "What if we stop them? Physically? What if we chain ourselves to them? They can't go through with it if we're all together." The silence that followed her suggestion hung heavy in the air. No one spoke for a moment, as if the idea was too outlandish to be real. But then Liam nodded, a twisted smile creeping onto his face. "Let's do it," he said firmly. And so, as the recess ended and the judge called the court back to order, The triplets sprang into action. With a quick glance to ensure no one was watching, they snuck behind the courtroom's wooden doors and gathered the chains they had stashed in a bag. Their hearts pounded in their chests, their hands trembling as they prepared for the impossible. In that moment, as they slowly approached their parents, the weight of what they were about to do hit them all at once. It wasn't just about stopping the divorce anymore. It was about saving their family, about holding on to the only thing they had left before it slipped through their fingers. The mystery now was not whether they could succeed, but whether their parents would even notice them, let alone understand their actions. The triplets, still young and hopeful, had no idea how their drastic measure would change everything. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of a chain of events that would force all of them to face the truths they had been avoiding. Truths about love, family, and sacrifice. As the judge called the court back to order, the triplets' hearts raced with anticipation. The tension in the room had reached a fever pitch, but now there was something else, an undercurrent of defiance, of hope clinging to the last shred of possibility. Chloe, Liam, and Noah were determined to do whatever it took to stop their parents from going through with the divorce. They had no idea how their drastic move would be received, but they knew they couldn't sit idly by any longer. This was their chance, and they couldn't back down now. The courtroom had resumed, but the atmosphere was colder than ever. Emma and Derek barely exchanged a glance, their lawyers continuing to argue over custody and property as if the children weren't even in the room. Chloe's stomach churned as she watched her parents, two people who once seemed inseparable, sitting so far apart. Derek's eyes were locked on his lawyer, while Emma stared blankly at the table, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. The spark that had once lit up their marriage had long since been extinguished, and all that was left was a cold, fractured shell. But the triplets weren't about to let it end this way. With quick, practiced movements, Chloe, Liam, and Noah quietly made their way towards the front of the courtroom, their chains clinking softly in the silence. They didn't look at anyone but each other, a shared resolve in their eyes. Chloe was first to move. She reached for the nearest chain, wrapping it around her wrist before handing the other end to Liam. Noah followed, taking the final length of chain. In one fluid motion, they linked themselves to their parents. The sound of metal clinking as the chains locked together was like a sudden, sharp breath drawn in the middle of a nightmare. The courtroom fell silent as every eye turned towards them, shocked and confused. Derek's gaze snapped up to his children, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. Emma's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat as she looked from her children to the chains that now bound them to their parents. "What are you doing?" Derek's voice broke the silence, low and menacing. His eyes narrowed, not in concern, but in irritation, as if his children's actions were an inconvenience. "We're not letting you get a divorce," Liam said boldly, his voice filled with a surprising confidence. "We won't let you break this family apart." Chloe, standing next to him, echoed the sentiment. "We love you both, and we're not going to lose you." Noah, quiet as ever, stood beside his siblings, his eyes fixed on his parents. He didn't speak, but the weight of his presence was enough. They were united in their cause, no matter the consequences. The judge's gavel slammed down on the table with a sharp crack, trying to regain control. "This is highly inappropriate," she snapped, her eyes darting between the triplets and the parents. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove those chains immediately, or I'll have to call for a recess." But the triplets didn't move. They stood firm, the chains a visible representation of their desperate fight. Emma's gaze flickered between her children and her husband. For a moment there was a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or pain, but it was quickly masked by the coldness that had defined her actions up until now. Derek, on the other hand, seethed with frustration. "This is a courtroom, not a playground," he snapped, attempting to pull away from the chains. But the more he struggled, the more the triplets stood their ground. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple act of rebellion. The triplets weren't merely acting out. They were showing their parents the one thing they couldn't ignore, their love. They were forcing their parents to confront the family they were about to tear apart, And for a moment, that confrontation felt more real than anything else in the room. The walls Emma and Derek had built around their hearts, walls that had allowed their marriage to crumble, were now being tested. Tension simmered as the moments stretched on. The triplets were no longer just children. They had become the embodiment of the love and hope their parents had forgotten. And while Emma and Derek struggled to understand this dramatic gesture, they couldn't ignore the raw, unfiltered emotion behind it. This was their family, chained together by the unwavering bond of love. The question was no longer about who would win the divorce. It was about whether that love was strong enough to break the chains of resentment that had bound them for so long. As the courtroom buzzed with whispers and the judge prepared to intervene, the triplets stood, defiant and resolute. They weren't just fighting for their parents' love. They were fighting for the hope that it wasn't too late. The room felt like it was suffocating. The gavel had fallen, but the tension hung in the air, thick and heavy. The triplets, still chained together, stood silently, their backs straight, their eyes unwavering. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Emma and Derek sat across from each other, their faces hard, but their eyes betraying the storm brewing within them. Derek was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with frustration. "What do you want from us?" His words were low, barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of years of unresolved pain. "This isn't how it works. We've been fighting for too long. This is for the best." Chloe's voice trembled as she stepped forward, the weight of her words heavy in the room. "Is this really what's best? For us? For the family? You don't even talk to each other anymore. All we see is hurt, and all we feel is your anger. Why don't you fight for us?" Liam, standing beside her, added in a forceful tone, "You've already made up your minds, but you don't even see us. You don't see what this is doing to us, to the whole family. We can't just pretend like everything is fine when it isn't." Emma's hands trembled in her lap. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together. But now, looking at her children, at their raw, unfiltered emotions, she felt something shift within her. She had been holding on to her anger, to the idea that Derek was the cause of all her pain, but looking at her children now, she couldn't deny the ache in her chest. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she looked at her kids, her voice breaking. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt you. But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I even want to anymore." Derek's face softened for the first time in months. He leaned forward, his voice filled with regret. "Emma, The judge interrupted, but the words didn't matter anymore. The triplets had accomplished something more profound than they had ever imagined. In the midst of their desperate act, their parents had been forced to confront the truth they had been avoiding, the emotional rift that had divided them for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma and Derek looked at each other not as adversaries, but as two people who had once loved each other deeply. The walls that had kept them apart began to crumble, bit by bit. It wasn't fixed, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Hope that maybe the triplets' love could be the bridge to healing. The brief moment of vulnerability that had swept over Emma and Derek began to dissipate, replaced by the harsh realities they had been avoiding for so long. The triplets stood there, still chained to their parents, watching the emotional distance that had existed between Emma and Derek slowly reemerge. The brief flicker of hope felt fragile, like a candle threatened by a gust of wind. Derek pulled away first, his face tight with frustration, his fingers curling into fists. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pushing back his chair. His voice was louder now, tinged with anger. "You think this is going to fix anything? This is just a game to you, isn't it?" Emma's expression hardened, the mask of indifference she had carefully constructed over the years slipping back into place. She stood up, her eyes filled with cold determination. "You don't understand, Derek. This isn't about us anymore. It's about them. They deserve better than this. I'm not pretending anymore." Her words were like a slap to the face, but Derek didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at her, the hurt in his eyes cutting deeper than anything else. "You've been pretending for years, Emma, and I've been trying to fix something that's broken. But you've already made up your mind, haven't you? You've chosen to leave, and you're just dragging us along. The triplets flinched as their parents' words became sharper, more cutting. The hope they had clung to moments ago was quickly fading into bitterness. The chains around their wrists felt heavier now, as if the emotional weight of their parents' conflict had become their burden too. Chloe, Liam, and Noah exchanged nervous glances. They had hoped to be the catalyst for change, but now they realized the depth of the rift between their parents was deeper than they could have ever imagined. The distance between them was too great to bridge with a simple act of defiance. The courtroom felt colder, and the walls of separation between Emma and Derek felt as insurmountable as ever. They had given up on each other, and nothing, not even the love of their children, seemed to be enough to turn the tide. The chains, which had once symbolized the triplets' hope to keep their family together, now felt like shackles, both physically and emotionally. What if this was it? What if their family was truly broken beyond repair? For the first time, Chloe felt the weight of her actions. Were they simply prolonging the inevitable? As Derek stormed toward the door, Emma's eyes locked onto the triplets, but there was no tenderness in her gaze anymore, just resignation. She had tried, but it felt like too little, too late. The room was filled with a deafening silence, and in that silence the triplets finally understood the harsh truth. No matter how much they loved each other, sometimes love alone wasn't enough to fix the cracks in a broken marriage. The chain they had bound their parents with had only made the fracture more evident. The fight for their family wasn't over. It had only just begun. The courtroom, once filled with anticipation, now felt like a battlefield. Derek had stormed out, leaving a trail of bitter words in his wake, while Emma stood frozen in place, her face a mask of defeat. The triplets, still chained together, were left in the aftermath of their parents' clash, feeling the weight of their actions and the harsh realization that their family was not going to be saved so easily. For a moment, the world seemed to come to a halt. The triplets stood motionless, the chains around their wrists a cruel reminder of how far they had gone and how far they still had to go. They had hoped to fix things with an act of desperation, but now they were left to witness the unraveling of everything they had known. Chloe, struggling to hold back tears, looked at her brothers. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, but now she felt powerless. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "We just made everything worse. We were supposed to help, but now I don't know if it's even possible." Liam, his anger now simmering beneath the surface, clenched his fists. He wanted to scream, to demand that their parents listen, but he knew deep down that his outbursts wouldn't change anything. "We didn't break them, Chloe," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "They've been broken for a long time. We're just trying to make them see it." Noah, ever the quiet one, looked at his siblings, his usually soft eyes filled with an intensity neither of them had seen before. "Maybe we can't fix it," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than they expected, "but we need to try something else." Chloe turned to Noah, her face a mixture of confusion and hope. "What do you mean?" Noah's gaze shifted to the door where Derek had exited. "We've been trying to fix what's broken between them, but maybe we need to fix what's broken inside of us, inside them. We can't make them love each other again, but we can show them that we're still here, still a family. We have to remind them what that means." The words hit Chloe like a thunderbolt. She had been so focused on the idea of saving her parents' marriage that she had lost sight of what mattered most, the family they still had. She looked at her brothers and then back at Emma, who still stood motionless, her face pale and distant. With a deep breath, Chloe made a decision. It was time to stop trying to force her parents back together. She couldn't fix their marriage, but she could rebuild the bond that still connected all of them. The triplets were a family, and no matter what happened to Emma and Derek, that bond was unbreakable. "We need to go after them," Chloe said, her voice now firm. "Not as a way to force them back together, but to remind them that we're here, that we still love them. We have to show them that it's not just about us keeping them together. It's about them fighting for what they still have left." Liam, for once, didn't argue. Instead, he gave her a nod of agreement. "You're right. We've been so focused on the end of their marriage, we forgot that there's still hope for all of us." Noah's eyes softened as he glanced toward the door. "Let's go, then." The triplets, still chained together, walked toward the door. It wasn't just about saving their parents anymore. It was about showing them that even in the darkest moments, love could still be a choice they all had to make. Emma and Derek might have been on the brink of separation, but the triplets were about to show them that family wasn't just about being together when things were easy. It was about fighting for each other, no matter the cost. As they left the courtroom and stepped into the hallway, the world felt different. The weight of the chains around their wrists no longer felt like a symbol of desperation, but a representation of their unbreakable bond. The triplets had decided to stop being passive bystanders in their family's unraveling. Now they were the ones who would take the first step toward healing, not just for their parents, but for themselves. They found Derek outside, pacing in front of the building. He looked up as they approached, his face a mix of anger and exhaustion. But as soon as he saw his children, standing together with a determination he hadn't seen before, something shifted in him. He stopped pacing and stood still, his gaze fixed on the triplets. "We're still a family, Dad," Chloe said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart, "and we're not going anywhere." Derek's hardened expression softened, a crack appearing in the armor he had built around himself. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told them everything they needed to know. There was still a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. The transformation wasn't immediate. It wouldn't happen overnight. But in that moment, the triplets understood that saving their family wouldn't come from forcing their parents together, but from the love and strength they carried within themselves. And with that, they took their first step toward healing, knowing that no matter what came next, they would nev. The air outside was crisp, and the sound of distant traffic felt strangely distant, as if the world beyond the courthouse didn't matter anymore. The triplets, still standing united, looked at their parents, Emma and Derek, who stood a few feet away, their expressions unreadable but softening. The weight of the courtroom, the tension, the anger, and the hurt had finally started to lift, replaced by a shared silence that spoke volumes. Emma was the first to break the stillness. Her voice, once cold and detached, was now softer, fragile. I don't know what to say." Her words hung in the air, but there was no longer bitterness behind them. Instead, it was vulnerability, the raw, unspoken fear of losing everything. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you all." Derek stood next to her, his posture less rigid, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. He looked at the triplets, his gaze softening. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't know where we go from here, but I'm still here, for you, for all of us." The triplets, though still uncertain about what the future held, felt something shift, a quiet, unspoken promise. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. Their parents had taken the first steps toward healing, not just for their marriage, but for the family as a whole. As they walked out of the courthouse, the chains that had once bound them together now felt lighter, not because the struggle was over, but because they had taken control of their own journey. They were still a family, and that, in itself, was enough.